Imagine, if you will, a doorway to unlocking hundreds of stories of ancient lands where dinosaurs roamed. And terror filled the sky, and something lurked beyond the window's glow, setting a course of a steampunk adventure. Or where zombies need brains. For these storytellers, the words do pile up.
Hey guys, I am Alexander G.R. Gideon, writer of dark fantasy, historical fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. My first book, A Web of Crimson, is available on Amazon now. It's also available on Amazon Unlimited, so you can read it for free if you have that. For short stories, I actually made my debut in the charity anthology, Chasing the Light, available on Amazon still. And I've been in 3 Zombies Need Brains anthologies: Razor's Edge, Temporally Deactivated, and My Battery's Low and It's Getting Dark.
Hi everybody, I'm Rosemary Claire Smith. I figured out the other day that this is my 20th anniversary from the first time I had a short story published, which was in Analog Science Fiction and Fact. That's probably where I am best known for my work. I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror. A lot of it is about dinosaurs. I don't just write short work. I also have a game, T-Rex Time Machine, which is a 170-word interactive adventure novel, if you're in the mood for something longer than that. In terms of my stories, you can get a flavor of it. This is an analog cover story, Diamond Jim and the Dinosaurs. I have been published, in addition to analog, in Amazing Stories, Fantastic Stories, Digital Science Fiction, a bunch of anthologies, and I have several works coming out in the next year or so. I can't mention them all, but one I can mention is the July-August issue of Analog is going to have my alternate history of the 1960s space race to the moon.
Hi, I'm Anita Stewart. I write under A.F. Stewart. I write dark fantasy, horror. I have a couple of series under my belt. Camelot Immortals, actually, the prequel is actually short stories. And I also have this collection, Visions and Nightmares, horror fantasy. I also have a couple of horror Killers and Demons collections, and I have some fairy tale stuff in Fairy Tale Punked, and a couple of steampunk stories kicking around as well. And my favorite short story is in Hell's Empire, and you should go read that because it's an awesome book.
Hey everybody, I'm Jay, and I write as Jae LaVelle. My genres are they're horror and paranormal suspense or paranormal thriller, however you want to look at it. And though I have several novels out, I started out with short stories, and short stories are kind of my true love. I find that I can really get the most impact in a short story, and all of my shorts are really, they're pulled from real life situations or real life ideas, and then I just build them up and make them creepier and hopefully to make your skin crawl a little bit. I've been published in, numerous nonfiction magazines when I first got started before I realized I didn't care for that. And then my short stories have been published in Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. And just last year, I released a collection of short stories called Flutter of Darkness, which is by far my favorite work that I've published.
It's time to tell a story in 30 minutes or less. This is Genres Short Stories. The short story is a unique medium. It is a unique way to tell a story, and I'm kind of curious to start with everybody. How did you all get started with the short story?
Well, short stories inspired my writing, so it was kind of a natural starting off point for me because Ray Bradbury's All Summer in a Day was really what inspired me to be a writer. And I used to read a lot of Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine short stories. Mm-hmm. And the what they could do with those stories in such a small amount of time and such an emotional impact, that's kind of what I wanted to do.
I kind of feel the same as Anita. I think that short stories were the first things that inspired me to write. My favorite author as a young adult was Stephen King, and had several wonderful collections of short stories that were definitely weren't kid appropriate that I read anyway. And I like the idea of telling this whole cool story, but in less than 1,000 pages or whatever his normal novels were. And so for me, short stories, they work a lot better with my brain. My brain, I don't have that long of attention span, and sometimes a story just doesn't take that long to tell. Sometimes you just want that little snippet.
I'm kind of the same way. Short stories were the thing that I started reading. In fact, when I was growing up, my parents had old copies of fantasy and science fiction magazine from the 50s and 60s and 70s around, and Galaxy magazine as well. And I can still remember stories I read in those. Ray Bradbury, and of course later on I got into Ursula Le Guin, and a whole lot of people that were just writing wonderful, wonderful short stories. And that was kind of where science fiction was a long time ago, and what I had around and available. As a writer, I originally started out when I was in high school. I thought I would write poetry. That kind of went by the wayside. So for me, short stories are going to the longer form than where I initially started.
The first couple of stories that I wrote were actually horror stories, which is funny because I currently have not published any horror. But the first three things that I did when I was really made the decision to be a professional writer were short stories. And really, I gravitated to them mostly because they were submissions that I can do that didn't require an agent. They were also things that I could complete in a reasonable amount of time, because as I was cutting my teeth as a writer, trying to write something of novel length was super daunting. In fact, I've not written something of novel length yet. My book, A Web of Crimson, is a novella, so it comes in around about 37,000 words or so, as opposed to 90 to 120, which is standard. I went from reading these huge tomes to my first story I ever wrote was 989 words, something like that. It was a real short, really, it was more flash fiction than short story, honestly. And then just being able to get in with Zombies Need Brains. It was a goal of mine ever since I found out about them. It took me about 5 years, actually, to get in with one of theirs. And honestly, writing short stories taught me how to craft a story from start to finish. I don't think that I would have been able to have written any of the books that I've written after that if I hadn't started and cut my teeth on those short stories.
Well, we can get into that. I was going to get into that a little bit later, but the idea that there's a different mindset with writing a short story versus writing a novella, in writing a novel, even writing poetry. What was the initial approach for you in terms of short stories, and what is it now? I mean, you all have published with short stories, so you know that there is a viable opportunity with them. So sticking with them, have you just decided that this is the form I like? Or, I mean, what was your mindset with short stories in terms of how it leads you further into your writing career?
I do think that there is a mindset out there that it's a lot easier to break in if you want to go the traditional publishing route with short stories. That there's a lot of markets. It's not going to take you as long to write it, to find people willing to read it and give you feedback. If you are taking classes, a lot of them will focus on short fiction just because it's easier for a group to critique short fiction than something that's longer. Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of a predilection towards it. And yes, absolutely, there was a time when so much of novels, you had to find an agent, and that was very difficult. It's changed a lot. I think these days now that a lot of people are starting out as indie authors, and a lot of people don't even see the need to go the traditional publishing route at all. But when I started more than 20 years ago, short stories were the were looked upon as the way to get into it. And I had gone to the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, which is a 6-week program, and that focused on short stories. And so it was an intensive training for them. Now, I do think some people are just natural novelists and cannot write at a short length. And that's cool. And I think, too, there are a lot of people who think, well, I'll break in with short fiction because it's somehow easier. And then I'll go to what I really want, which is novels. And that's perfectly fine as well. But, it depends on the idea, on the characters, on the setting. All of that thrown together, is it something that just works better as a short story or a novella or a novel? Every literary endeavor, I guess, you have to answer those questions for yourself afresh.
Do you feel like even now, I mean, back then it was a gateway more so than it was now, but do you feel like now that you do have that option to be an indie published author, that there's something to be said for the opposite, which is, you know what, I think I'm better at a short story, so I'm going to stick with the short story kind of aspect?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. And
Yeah.
even for people who have started in traditional publishing, whether it's short stories or novels, these days a lot of people will get their rights reverted back to them, and they will have their novel length stuff reprinted on their own, or they will issue collections of short stories independently. So it's very much, you can do both.
I'd also like to add about the indie world with short stories. A lot of indie writers are using short stories now as reader magnets, as complementary books and things for their series or whatever as well. Mm-hmm. So there's an emerging market in the indie world as well for short stories.
I plain old like short stories. I like reading them. I like writing them. And, Rosemary mentioned the idea that some people think that, writing a short story is easy or easier. And I think that there's definitely less time involved. A novel might take me a year or two, and I'm a slow writer. Whereas a short story might take me days or weeks or months. But I think that they're more intense. I love true crime. So let's look at this from a killer's standpoint. A novel to me is more like a serial killer, where you start out with a kill, there's a cooling off period, intrigue starts to develop, there's another kill, and then more is developing and another kill. Whereas a short story is kind of like a rampage killer. The whole thing is passion. The whole thing has to be phenomenal from start to finish. There's no fluff. There's no waiting. There's no cooling off. You've just got to deliver everything in those, whatever word count you choose. For me, I like around 10,000 words, but it's all got to be primo quality stuff. There's not a lot of room for error with them. So they really are. I mean, they're different than a novel, and they're certainly challenging in their own way.
For those of you who thought we were going to talk about fairy tales and happy endings, you're in the wrong show.
Yeah. I'm actually writing a short story collection about fairy tales, and there's no happy endings.
Nice.
Honestly, it can definitely still be a gateway to other things. If with my books, with my sales, my own personal things, not the anthologies, it would take me a very long time to have ever qualified for SIFLA. Just with my low sales and that kind of thing, as I'm just starting out. Having those 3 Zombies Need Brains anthologies, though, I'm a SIFLA writer now because I've sold to a professional market 3 times. And so there's other things, other doors that can be open, not just to traditional publishing. But I also think, one of the big benefits of short stories and anthologies specifically, where you've got to go through submissions, is learning how to get through that slush pile. Because writing for a slush pile is so different than, writing a short story for a series, or or a short story that's, a giveaway. They're still difficult to write. It's still something that has to be, really tight, really good. But it's really interesting to me, especially when I'm reading through the anthologies. I always love going through it first. I always read through the anthologies, but I love my first read through is opening up each story and reading the first line. because you can always tell who made it through submission and who is an anchor author. Because almost without fail, the submission authors have a better first line than any anchor author does.
So the ones who had to audition
Yeah.
had to work for it.
And there are some of those lines that you just go, that was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. I was helping out with an anthology once, reading through submissions that were in the slush pile, and yeah, some of them, just the amount of effort they have put into making their submission perfect, and that's really, if you're gonna submit, it's what you've got to strive for, is that perfection.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? There is a discipline to short stories. There is a structure. There is an idea that you really, at the heart of it, do you feel like it can make you a better writer because you have to get to the point right away. You have to tell the story and capture the reader almost immediately and keep them there for a short period of time, but you still have to capture them. There is a discipline to kind of bang, bang, bang. There's a method to the madness, right?
Every sentence, every paragraph that you have has to do at least double duty, or maybe it has to do triple duty. You can't have a paragraph just lovingly explaining all these neat little details about your world. It's as you say, it's got to be bang, bang, bang. There's got to be things that are going on, and there's got to be character development, and it's all got to be rolled up into every paragraph, every sentence. And the editing passes, I think, a lot of times can be, how do I hone this down, and how do I make it sharper and punchier, and get rid of what you call fluff, which is a good word for it.
Take us through your process in when you do sit down to decide to write a short story. Is it an idea that you have that you tried out somewhere else? Was it something that you're basing it upon, you're looking at the submission forms that you're looking at, and you just ran across something and you came up with an idea? When do you feel like you get the flow for a short story? When do you feel like you're into writing a short story?
For me, and anyone who's talked to me before knows that I'm not what you would call a disciplined writer, or a disciplined person for that matter. So I don't try to force myself to come up with these ideas. But about a month or so, maybe 2 months ago, I kind of was seeing in my head this scene of this, young girl that was sitting in a bedroom closet, and she was very, very ill or depressed, and there was this strange, creepy guy sitting next to her talking to her. And in my head, it reminded me of kind of a devil at the crossroads type situation, where this strange figure was trying to make a deal with her, and I couldn't figure out why he would be making a deal with her or anything else to do with the plot. And then just the other day, my youngest told me about how they were being bullied at school. They described exactly what was going on, and of course it made me really angry. But that anger and that idea that she had told me about kind of made its way into the story. I'm like, okay, well, I have a focus for this now. I know what's going to happen, even though it's not fully formed. I could sit down tomorrow and write this story, and I feel comfortable with that now. But I usually need 2 or 3 things to just kind of randomly click in my brain before I can actually get it out.
It's kind of the same way with me. It's usually some kind of an idea that clicks in my brain, and I'm going, ooh, that sounds interesting. And then it sort of develops into a short story. It's like, but then sometimes when I'm doing submissions, like I'm doing to a themed on, like with Hell's Empire, it was a themed submission. The theme was Hell invades Britain, Victorian Britain. And so I'm going, well, what do I want to write about? And I was thinking, well, it would be an interesting idea to write about the home front, like kind of a World War II scenario, like the Battle of Britain, only in Victorian England and hell. And that's where the story came from there.
Honestly, most of the stories that I've written have been for themed anthologies. So I've basically had a prompt. But honestly, I like that because most of the stories that I've written and published, I never would have written if it hadn't been for that themed anthology. Like the first story that I sold was to the Razor's Edge, and it's about a were-squirrel infiltrator that finds herself in the midst of a civil war between humans and were creatures. And the whole idea came about of a different anthology from Zombies Eat Brains. I originally wrote the story for their anthology Where, using different were creatures. And the whole idea was writing were creatures that weren't wolves or cats, because you see all of those. And so I saw that, I was like, yeah, that's really interesting. And I was like, what kind of creature, or what kind of animal could I use as a were? And I was like, what about a squirrel? That'd be funny. They'd make really good infiltrators. Like, squirrels can get in anywhere, and the whole idea blossomed from there. Honestly, about the only short story that I've come up with or had an idea for that was outside of those anthologies is one that I'm playing around with for the Shadow Council Archives books, my Books of the Law series with A Web of Crimson.
Mhm.
And there's I haven't been able to figure out how to really work in Crowley doing the working that he did in the Boleskine house, because I wouldn't really fit in with the story just because of what it took to do that ritual. But I've been playing around with a short story for it, so that one's kind of spawned outside of an anthology.
Kind of the opposite of Alexander in that early on I had one story that I had written that I submitted for a themed anthology, and it happened to fit, and they took it. And recently I've had two more that are going to be coming out that I wrote specifically for themed anthologies. But that said, I almost never have good luck when I do that. They get rejected, and then I feel like, okay, so then I'm submitting to the established short story markets, and they're reading a million of the rejects from some Zombies Need Brains theme. And I just don't want to be in that category. And honestly, the stuff that I think about just doesn't fit in any of these categories. And I get interested in other things. So a lot of my ideas come from science, from my reading about dinosaurs. I should say, too, I started out as an archaeologist, so I'm very interested in prehistoric civilizations and going farther back to the age of the dinosaurs, and also mythology. And so, since I still read in all of those fields, that's what gets my thinking going. I tend to start with the ideas as opposed to starting with the characters.
The one thing about stories, and you've all touched upon it, you've been rejected for anthologies before, and the idea for short story, how recyclable it is, how amazingly versatile it can be, and market in a marketing standpoint as well. When you look at something where you may have shelved it, like with a novel, if you shelf it, you shelf it. Right, it goes away. Nobody ever sees it. Nobody thinks about it until you decide to dust it back off and play with it again. Or the idea is, though, the short story is its own story already. It's already formed. It's already there. To use it for maybe like a website, or maybe for a blog post, or use it for your newsletter or something to that effect. Do you find that whenever you're writing these short stories, holding on to them is paramount, because you never know, you could use it for another anthology, you could submit it for this? How many times have you recycled a story?
Well, generally, my rejected short stories end up in my collections.
Nice.
There's at least two of them in here that one was rejected and one didn't get submitted because the anthology collapsed before submission. But I just often just chuck them out into my own collections. But sometimes they get recycled into other places as well.
I think that for me, and my book of short stories that came out last year has all of my short stories, at least all of them that I could find, and the oldest one in there is probably 15 years old, from back when I was still doing stuff in college, and so I definitely get use out of them. A handful of them have already been published, and they've since the exclusivity has dropped off, and but I've kind of stopped writing for other publications now, because I don't know, my ideas are just kind of weird, and I don't always want to form and mold them into what somebody else wants. So I think that any short stories that I write from here on out I'll just plan another collection out of them, and that's kind of what I'm going to do.
I have a lot of hope for my short stories that have been rejected and rejected. I one time sold something to the 19th market that I tried. And I always see the good in them. And, sometimes I'll pull one out that's maybe a few years old and look at it and think, well, okay, I can see why it really didn't get anywhere. But gosh, I could change this and I could change that and I could make it better. And sometimes I do, and then I send it off again. So hope springs eternal for my short stories. They're never too old to find a good home.
Or I want to make collections out of some stories. I actually have the story that was in My Battery is Low and It's Getting Dark, featured an incarnation of death that I had used in another short story that has not been published. And so the rights are reverting to that story here pretty soon. I think it's in June that I get the rights back for that story. And I'm thinking of bundling those two stories together and then possibly using the same version of death. And then having like a small novella out of those three stories that I can sell. Working title for that one would be When the Man Comes Around. I've also, the anthology that I'm in, Chasing the Light, that I really like the idea of is that you have themed anthologies, and then Chasing the Light is all over the place in terms of theme. It's everyone wrote a story that they thought that Melanie, who was the one of our writing group people that had passed away, that we dedicated the anthology to, we all wrote a story that we thought she would like. And so that ranged from my story, which was super bloody. I racked up a body count in the hundreds in that story, to the story that was right before mine, which was a like office comedy featuring a time traveling microwave. And so, which is a hard shift if you're reading that one linearly. Because it's like I think the last line of the story before mine was like, and I took a bite of my new favorite lunch, a sandwich, and then you get to mine and it was like my blade slid perfectly between the second and third vertebrae, and you're just like, whoa, you get like whiplash from it. But I like the idea of doing an anthology of my own that's like that, where it's 10 stories or so of mine, or maybe even less, that are all different. And it's the kind of thing that you can put on your table at a convention, and when someone says, I like a little bit of everything, you can go, well, this has got a little bit of everything.
If new writers were to approach you, would you suggest the short story as the way to start out? Or do you feel like it's whatever they want to do? Do you feel like the short story is for people who want to write short stories?
Ooh, I have a good idea. And it's something I've done with one of my own stories. I took my novel that I had already written and just grabbed a character out of it and just decided to write a little short story about that character. And readers seem to really like that, especially if they enjoyed your original novel. But I would say if you have this idea for a novel, just grab one little scene out of it, grab one character out of it, and write a little bit. And even if it's not going to be a published short story, that is a great writing exercise to help you learn the craft more.
I definitely recommend writing short stories to hone the craft, because it makes you write tighter. And if you have a death wish, try flash fiction or drabbles, because if you can write a 100-word story and make it sound good, you can write anything.
I do hear a lot of would-be writers and starting out writers say, well, everything I start, it turns out to be the first chapter of a novel sort of thing. And I would really urge them to try to do a short story and start out right at the beginning, but then don't write the middle part. Just jump and write what the ending is. And then, well, how long is it going to take you to go from that beginning to that ending? Maybe it really can be a lickety-split short story. And try it and get out of your comfort zone.
Writing short stories is great for a couple of reasons. And one of them is it lets you finish something. And especially if you've never written a novel before, you've never written a novella before, something of that length can be really daunting. And so writing a short story is something that you can complete. And it's going to make you feel good about yourself as a writer, because you know, I can complete something.